In the 1970s, sci-fi filmmakers weren't just dreaming of flying cars. They were getting their movies dragged into court, yanked off shelves, or straight up pulled from cinemas. Why did governments freak out over space sex, mutant bears, and brain-eating parasites? This was the decade when cinema's boundaries exploded outward, while censors desperately tried to contain the fallout. The 1970s marked a perfect storm. Relaxing social mores, emerging independent studios, cheaper film equipment, and global political paranoia all converged to create a breeding ground for transgressive cinema. 1. A Clockwork Orange, 1971. Stanley Kubrick's Technicolor nightmare drops us into a neon-lit Britain where Beethoven meets baseball bat beatdowns, and the result was international panic. Based on Anthony Burgess's 1962 novel, Kubrick's adaptation follows Alex DeLarge, Malcolm McDowell, and his droogs through a dystopian landscape of sexual violence, behavioral conditioning, and state control. The film's stylized violence, set to classical music and candy-colored futuristic sets, created a visceral cognitive dissonance that authorities couldn't stomach. Ireland slammed down an outright ban that lasted until 2000. Apartheid-era South Africa nixed it for 13 years. Despite the irony that a film about authoritarian control was banned by an authoritarian regime. Singapore kept it underground for 3 decades, while Brazil banned it outright during its military dictatorship. But the most fascinating censorship came from Kubrick himself, who pulled the film from British distribution after receiving death threats and learning of copycat crimes allegedly inspired by the film's ultraviolence. Critics called it pornography of violence, yet it raked in $114 million on a $1.3 million budget and snagged 4 Oscar nominations. The film's invented slang, horror show, viddy, droog, entered cultural vocabulary, while its milk bars, cod pieces, and bowler hats defined a dystopian aesthetic that still influences filmmakers today. What made it truly dangerous to authorities wasn't just the violence, it was the seductive presentation. When Alex struts down the Korova milk bar in slow motion, or dances while attacking a writer and his wife to Singin' in the Rain, Kubrick creates a terrifying complicity with the viewer. We're horrified yet compelled, and censors worldwide recognize that power. The film remained officially unavailable in the UK until Kubrick's death in 1999, creating a thriving black market of bootleg VHS tapes, turning censorship into the best free marketing campaign in cinema history. 2. On the Silver Globes. Imagine Andrei Tarkovsky on acid. Astronauts found a moon colony, devolve into bird mask zealots, then crown a messiah from Earth as their savior. Director Andrzej Żuławski's cosmic epic remains one of cinema's greatest what-ifs, a film so politically dangerous that Warsaw's communist authorities didn't just ban it. They attempted to erase it from existence. Based on The Lunar Trilogy by Żuławski's great-uncle Jerzy, the film follows humans who establish a colony on another planet, following their evolution into a primitive society over generations. When a modern astronaut arrives, he's mistaken for a prophesied savior, a messianic narrative that Poland's Soviet-aligned government recognized as politically explosive. The film's true transgression was its thinly veiled critique of totalitarianism, religious manipulation, and Poland's communist regime. 2 years into production, with 80% of shooting complete, Poland's Deputy Minister of Cultural Affairs ordered the project terminated. Sets were bulldozed, costumes destroyed, and negatives confiscated. The official reason? Dangerous metaphysics and budgetary concerns. But the real motivation was fear of the film's anti-authoritarian subtext during a period of increasing civil unrest. Żuławski, devastated, fled to France. But a determined film editor secretly preserved the footage that had already been processed. For 11 years, these reels remained hidden until Poland's communist system began collapsing in 1988. Only then could Żuławski assemble what remained, a fractured masterpiece where missing scenes are replaced with Żuławski's narration over documentary footage of 1980s Poland, creating an accidental meta-commentary on censorship itself. The film finally premiered at Cannes in 1988, days before the Iron Curtain began to crack. Its surreal imagery, warriors in feathered masks, ritual sacrifices, cosmic mysticism, represented exactly the kind of spiritual questioning that materialist communist ideology feared. State censorship tried to kill it. Bootleggers made it a legend. Today it stands as both an unfinished sci-fi epic and a powerful artifact of political repression. Shivers, 1975. David Cronenberg's condominium set outbreak, where sex-hungry parasitic leeches turn upscale tenants into rabid swingers, sparked a genuine moral meltdown that reached the highest levels of a government. Also released as They Came From Within, this low-budget Canadian shocker takes place entirely within the sterile Starliner Towers apartment complex, where a scientist's experiment creates phallic parasites that trigger uninhibited sexual behavior in their hosts. The controversy began when prominent Canadian critic Robert Fulford, writing under the pseudonym Marshall Delaney, published a scathing review titled, "You Should Know How Bad This Film Is. You Paid For It," in Saturday Night Magazine. Fulford was outraged that the publicly funded Canadian Film Development Corporation had supported such depraved slime, triggering a parliamentary debate about film funding. Canadian MPs literally discussed the film on the floor of Parliament, questioning whether taxpayers should fund body horror. The debate extended internationally, with Westminster Council banning screenings in central London, and newspapers wailing that society would collapse if such films became mainstream. Australia heavily censored it, while Britain's video nasty panic of the 1980s targeted it for home video restriction. What authorities found truly threatening wasn't just the gore or nudity, but Cronenberg's subversive suggestion that repression, not expression, was society's real disease. The parasites liberate their hosts from social constraints, turning a luxury apartment building into a communal orgy. For a post-sexual revolution, pre-AIDS culture still negotiating new boundaries, this vision struck a nerve with both progressives and conservatives. Despite, or because of, the controversy, Shivers became box office gold in Quebec, outgrossing The Godfather. Most international markets received heavily butchered prints, sometimes losing up to 20 minutes of footage. The parliamentary outrage nearly destroyed Cronenberg's career, but instead crowned him the undisputed king of body horror, a title he has maintained for nearly 5 decades. 4. Flesh Gordon, 1974. Jetpacks, ray guns, and stop-motion monsters, plus a planet ruled by the diabolical Emperor Wong and his sex ray that causes Earth's population to engage in spontaneous orgies. Michael Benveniste and Howard Ziem's pornographic parody of the Flash Gordon serials pushed the era's relaxing obscenity standards to their breaking point, creating a bizarre collision between sci-fi, comedy, and hardcore pornography. The film follows Flesh Gordon, Dale Ardor, and Dr. Flexi Jerkoff as they journey to the planet Porno to stop Emperor Wong's sex ray. Along the way, they encounter penis-shaped spaceships, a creature called the Great God Porno, and a variety of sexual situations that blend juvenile humor with explicit content. The production values were surprisingly high for an adult film, featuring legitimate stop-motion animation and special effects by industry professionals, some of whom later worked on Star Wars. Norway and New Zealand slapped outright bans. Singapore hid it until R21 ratings existed decades later. Even the United States gave it an X rating until significant cuts were made, removing most explicit sexual content while preserving the innuendo and partial nudity. This created 2 versions, an underground XXX cut and a more widely distributed R-rated version that played at midnight screenings. The film's $470,000 budget seemed risky for adult cinema at the time, but its $5 million box office proved that blending science fiction with sexual content could overcome censorship through sheer novelty. The production was plagued with problems, including a warehouse fire that destroyed original footage, forcing the filmmakers to complete the movie with fewer explicit scenes than planned, inadvertently helping its wider distribution. While critically dismissed as juvenile trash, Flesh Gordon developed a cult following that appreciated its intentionally campy approach to both science fiction and pornography. It remains significant as one of the most ambitious adult films of its era and a time capsule of the brief period when pornography seemed poised to enter mainstream cinema. The lesson? Add campy space smut, and censors will boost your profits through controversy and forbidden allure. 5. The Beast in Heat, 1977. Luigi Bazzella's Nazi-sploitation nightmare features a female SS doctor breeding a feral super soldier who assaults female prisoners in a concentration camp. Even by the standards of Italian exploitation cinema, this film, also known as SS Hell Camp, pushed beyond the boundaries of taste and decency, combining war atrocities with sexual violence in ways that triggered bans across multiple continents. The film belongs to a brief but notorious subgenre of exploitation films that use Nazi concentration camps as settings for graphic sexual content and torture scenes. This trend, which included films like Ilsa, She-Wolf of the SS, represented the darkest corner of 1970s exploitation cinema, using historical atrocities as backdrops for titillation, a practice that many countries considered literal criminal obscenity. Britain's Director of Public Prosecutions put it on the original Video Nasty blacklist under the Obscene Publications Act, making it illegal to distribute. Germany banned it under laws prohibiting Nazi glorification, while Australia refused classification entirely. Many countries still refuse theatrical bookings or streaming rights. The film became so notorious that British MPs specifically referenced it during Holocaust Memorial Day debates as an example of media that trivializes genocide. Critics universally condemned it as celluloid sewage, but grindhouse crowds queued to be outraged, creating a commercial market for films that transgressed every conceivable boundary of taste. The film's lasting infamy comes not from any artistic merit, it has none, but from its status as a test case for the limits of film censorship in democratic societies. It raised uncomfortable questions. Should democracies ban films, no matter how reprehensible? Does prohibition merely increase interest? At what point does depiction become exploitation of historical trauma? Unlike other entries on this list that gained artistic reappraisal over time, The Beast in Heat remains universally reviled, a cautionary example of exploitation without purpose or merit, and one of the few films whose censorship few cinephiles bother to challenge. 6th, SS Experiment Camp, 1976. Sergio Garone's entry in the Nazi-sploitation cycle triggered one of Britain's most intense media panics. Posters featuring a nude female prisoner hanging upside down on a crucifix-like structure ignited moral outrage before the reels even rolled. The film's plot, centered around a Nazi doctor attempting to transplant a prisoner's testicles to an injured SS officer, combined body horror, historical atrocity, and sexual violence in a package custom designed to trigger censorship. The UK banned it outright during the video nasty panic of the 1980s, when authorities targeted horror videos under obscenity laws. The film became a political football, with members of parliament citing it during Holocaust Memorial Day debates as evidence of moral decay. British tabloids like the Daily Mail dubbed it the sickest video on sale in Britain, despite few journalists having actually viewed the content they condemned. The film's notoriety far exceeded its actual content or commercial significance. When finally released uncut in the UK in 2005, after the British Board of Film Classification revised its guidelines, viewers discovered its mostly bad lighting and worse acting, proof that the ban was scarier than the movie itself. This pattern, moral panic exceeding the actual content, characterized much of the video nasty censorship wave, where perception and marketing often triggered bans more than the films themselves. What makes SS Experiment Camp historically significant isn't artistic merit, but its role in censorship debates. The film's provocative marketing deliberately baited controversy, using offensive imagery to generate the outrage that drove its commercial success in markets where it wasn't banned. For censorship historians, it represents a perfect case study in how prohibition often increases demand, and how moral campaigns against media can inadvertently serve as powerful promotion. 7. The Incredible Melting Man, 1977. Astronaut Steve West returns from Saturn's rings and literally melts, leaving gooey footprints and dismembered bodies across American suburbs in William Sax's drive-in shocker. The film's premise is deceptively simple. Cosmic radiation causes an astronaut to slowly dissolve while simultaneously driving him to consume human flesh, to temporarily halt his liquefaction. The Incredible Melting Man represents the perfect intersection of space-age paranoia and body horror, reflecting both Cold War fears of radiation and the era's fascination with physical decomposition. What elevated it from forgettable B-movie to censorship target was Rick Baker's groundbreaking special effects, which depicted the astronaut's deterioration in nauseating detail, with glistening tissue, exposed muscle, and dripping fluids that pushed the boundaries of what makeup effects could achieve in the pre-CGI era. India and Malaysia banned it outright. Japan and Italy slapped adults-only labels. UK censors demanded significant cuts, and American teenagers snuck into drive-ins nationwide to witness Baker's legendary slime effects. The film's marketing leaned heavily into the gore, with posters promising the first new horror creature, and emphasizing the melting process over plot or character. With a modest budget of $250,000, the film earned approximately $2 million, solid returns for independent horror. Its lasting cultural impact came decades later when Mystery Science Theater 3000 featured it in a legendary roasting session, introducing a new generation to its unintentional camp appeal. The film's peculiar legacy is that censors feared its effects would traumatize viewers, while modern audiences primarily find its earnest ineptitude hilarious. The Incredible Melting Man exemplifies how 1970s horror often channeled contemporary anxieties, in this case, fears of space exploration and radiation, into visceral body horror. Its censorship history reveals how groundbreaking special effects could trigger bans based on visual impact rather than thematic content. Not bad for a puddle with teeth. 8. Zombie Flesh Eaters, 1979. Lucio Fulci's Caribbean set zombie epic served eyeball splinters, voodoo rituals, and, most famously, an underwater sequence where a zombie wrestles a live tiger shark. Released as Zombie 2 in Italy, positioned as an unofficial sequel to George Romero's Dawn of the Dead, this film became ground zero in Britain's video nasty censorship battle, while simultaneously cementing Italian horror's international commercial appeal. The plot follows a woman investigating her father's mysterious disappearance on a tropical island, where a voodoo curse is reanimating the dead. What distinguished Fulci's vision from other zombie films was its unflinching gore, with the director's trademark extreme close-ups of eye trauma, graphic decomposition, and splatter effects that earned him the nickname the Godfather of Gore. Britain's Obscene Publications Act specifically targeted it as a video nasty, with police authorized to seize tapes from rental shops. Australia banned it entirely in 1980 for frequent high-impact violence, while Germany restricted it to adult audiences only. The British Board of Film Classification finally surrendered, allowing an uncut release in 2005, after decades of the film circulating via bootlegs and cut versions. The film's most notorious sequence, where an underwater zombie grapples with an actual shark, a scene filmed with a sedated shark and a stuntman in significant danger, exemplifies the anything-goes production ethics that made these films simultaneously problematic and compelling. No modern production would attempt such a dangerous stunt, creating a document of filmmaking practices that changing standards have rightfully abandoned. Zombie Flesh Eaters grossed 3 billion lira worldwide, approximately $3.5 million in 1979, demonstrating the international market for Italian horror and the commercial power of censorship controversies. Fulci, previously
known for giallo thrillers and comedies, found his greatest commercial success in gore, subsequently directing a series of increasingly extreme horror films. The moral? Never underestimate the box office power of censorship and marine undead brawls. 9. Rabid, 1977. David Cronenberg's second entry on our list stars former pornographic actress Marilyn Chambers as a woman who develops a vampiric stinger in her armpit after experimental skin grafts, triggering a rabies-like epidemic across Montreal. The film merges medical horror, vampire tropes, and pandemic anxiety in ways that foreshadowed both AIDS narratives and modern outbreak thrillers. Rabid follows Rose, Chambers, after a motorcycle accident leaves her severely burned. Treated at the Keloid Clinic for plastic surgery with experimental techniques, she develops a phallic stinger under her arm and an insatiable thirst for blood. Her victims develop a rabies-like condition, creating a citywide epidemic that leads to martial law and societal collapse. The casting of Chambers, then known for the pornographic film Behind the Green Door, was both a marketing tactic and a provocative artistic choice that blurred boundaries between mainstream and adult cinema. This casting decision alone triggered censorship concerns, with some countries objecting to a porn performer in a leading role regardless of content. Police seized VHS tapes during Britain's video nasty panic. Stores hid it under counters in numerous countries, and tabloids howled about X-rated zombies loose in suburbia. Sweden demanded cuts to blood-drinking scenes. Australia restricted it to adults only. And even in Cronenberg's native Canada, certain provinces required significant edits for theatrical release. What authorities found particularly disturbing was Cronenberg's clinical approach to sexual transmission of disease, a theme that became unintentionally prophetic when the AIDS crisis emerged years later. The film presents contagion as an intimate betrayal, where sexual contact becomes lethal, foreshadowing both viral anxieties and the body horror elements that would define Cronenberg's later masterpieces like Videodrome and The Fly. Despite, or because of, controversy, Cronenberg scored both drive-in cash and critical disgust, exactly the combination he has cultivated throughout his career. Rabid remains significant as both an early pandemic narrative and a key text in Cronenberg's ongoing exploration of body transformation and sexual politics. La bestia in calore, 1977. We saved a final shock, SS Experiment Camp's sibling film, La bestia in calore, The Beast in Heat. Same year, same exploitation wave, this time featuring a genetically engineered man-beast, unleashed on female resistance fighters by Nazi scientists. Often confused with the fifth entry on our list, they share an English title but are different films. This Luigi Bazzella atrocity represents the nadir of 1970s exploitation cinema. The plot, such as it is, involves Nazi Dr. Ellen Kratch performing experiments to create a superhuman soldier, resulting instead in a hairy, bestial creature with insatiable sexual appetites, who is then set loose on imprisoned female partisans. The thin narrative serves merely as a framework for scenes of torture, sexual violence, and war atrocities, filmed with an exploitative gaze that crosses every conceivable line of taste and decency. Banned in the UK as part of the video nasty purge, never screened theatrically in the United States, and marketed in Sweden with the bragging rights, so shocking it was banned in Norway. The film's distribution relied almost entirely on forbidden fruit appeal and shock value, with promotional materials emphasizing its censorship as a selling point. What distinguishes this entry from merely offensive trash is its peculiar science fiction element. The Nazi-created monster represents a perversion of both nature and science, combining mad scientist tropes with sexual exploitation in ways that triggered censorship on multiple grounds. The film appropriates legitimate historical traumas, concentration camps, Nazi medical experiments, and twists them into exploitation fare, raising ethical questions about the limits of fictional representation. Unlike other entries that found eventual critical reappraisal or developed cult followings based on artistic merit, La Bestia in Calore remains universally condemned. Its significance lies solely in its role as a censorship case study and as the outer boundary of what even the exploitation market would tolerate. Grindhouse legend secured through repulsion alone. The censorship battles of 1970s science fiction reveal how prohibition often achieves the opposite of its intended effect. Nearly every film on this list saw its commercial prospects and cultural footprint enlarged by banning orders. A Clockwork Orange's UK withdrawal created a mystique that drove international revenue. On the Silver Globe's suppression transformed an unfinished film into a political legend, and countless video nasties used their banned status as marketing hooks in less restrictive territories. This decade marked a turning point in censorship approaches. Traditional moral gatekeeping began giving way to age-based rating systems in many countries. Recognizing that outright bans often created black markets and underground cachet, the economic incentives became clear. Controversy sells tickets, and forbidden status can transform mediocre films into must-see events for the counterculture. For filmmakers, the lesson was equally clear. Directors like Cronenberg, who faced career-threatening backlash after Shivers, ultimately found that censorship controversies built loyal audiences hungry for boundary-pushing content. Many mainstream directors who emerged in subsequent decades, from Paul Verhoeven to Guillermo del Toro, have acknowledged the influence of these controversial 1970s genre films on their artistic development. The technological shift to home video fundamentally altered this dynamic. Where theatrical bans could once effectively limit a film's audience, VHS tapes could cross borders in luggage or plain brown envelopes. Britain's notorious video nasty panic represented the last gasp of comprehensive censorship, ultimately proving unenforceable as global media distribution networks expanded. Today's streaming era presents new challenges. Platform content policies often function as de facto censorship, with algorithms and corporate guidelines replacing government censors. But the underground circulation of controversial media continues through digital channels. The lesson from the 1970s remains relevant. Attempting to suppress provocative content often ensures its cultural survival. So there you have it. 10 celluloid renegades that proved the 1970s could out-weird, out-gore, and out-shock anything TikTok spits up today. This cinematic revolution happened precisely because boundaries existed to be broken, creating the perfect environment for transgressive creativity. Each film on our list, whether artistic achievement or exploitative trash, helped define where societies drew their lines around acceptable content. The scientific elements in these films weren't incidental to their censorship. They were often central. Body transformation, genetic experimentation, cosmic radiation, mind control, and alien infection provided frameworks for exploring taboo subjects that might otherwise have been explicitly banned. Science fiction created plausible deniability, allowing filmmakers to claim artistic and speculative merit while pushing into controversial territory. Which title would you resurrect for a midnight screening, and which one still feels untouchable? The dividing line often comes down to artistic intent. Kubrick and Cronenberg used shocking elements in service of genuine artistic visions, while the Nazi-sploitation cycle existed primarily to profit from offense. Yet all faced similar censorship, highlighting how blunt an instrument prohibition typically is. Drop your hottest take below. Was the censorship justified? Or did the bans just crank these films' cult status to warp speed? Tell us, and don't hold back. Because if history shows anything, it's that outrage sells tickets, and maybe even melts a man or two.